The first lecture for Unit 2, the Biodiversity Unit, is 2.1, Intro to Biodiversity. These are the essential skills. The learning objective is to understand the different levels of biodiversity and their importance. Essential knowledge is to know that the biodiversity includes genetic, species, and habitat, and so forth. Biodiversity basics basically indicates that biodiversity means that diversity of life is either all the life forms in the ecosystem, and it's measured at 3 different levels. For example, ecosystem diversity is the number of different habitats in the available area. For example, compare Nevada with California. Nevada basically has desert. California has everything from a desert to tundra, taiga, to coniferous forest. Species diversity is how many different species there are. The balance or evenness of the population within that system. For example, if we look at the difference of the number of species at the Arctic versus the rainforest. Within a species, we can look at the genetic diversity. Is there a huge diversity? Is there different abilities to withstand changes? The higher diversity, the higher the ecosystem or population health, more likely to not be destroyed. So let's first look at species. Species richness and evenness. Richness means how many different types of organisms are there. It is generally a good sign if there's lots and lots of different species, because that way there's more ability to live evenly within the system. Evenness is a measure of how the individuals are balanced. Do we have 25, 25, 25, 25%? Evenness indicates that even though there may be a common, more increased level of one, there is or two, like we see below. Community 1 is very, very even, where there's 25% of 1, whereas Community 2 has a richness of type brown tree. Genetic diversity also is beneficial. It's a measure of how, within a genome of a species, how many sets of genes, different types of genes, are they all basically identical, or is there variety? Okay, diversity occurs because of random mutations that have occurred in the DNA. And then when we recombine during sexual reproduction, that increases the amount of variation. So if the more chromosomes you have, the more variety you're going to have. The better the population can respond to the environment. Stressors like drought, disease, famine are not going to wipe out that particular species. If there is one of those stressors, the higher the genetic variability, the more likely that there's going to be one or two of the group, some of the group that's going to be able to survive. So if we look, for example, at the potato blight in Ireland many, many years ago, when they got the potatoes from Peru, in Peru they planted 100 different potatoes at one point in time. However, when we go to one potato, like they were doing in Ireland, and all of a sudden there's a blight, it's going to wipe out all the potatoes. It's going to have problems. So if we look at these if we look at the reduced biodiversity, can you compare these? If we look at suburban, is it likely to survive if there's going to be problems attacking the grass? If we look at the agriculture, if there's a problem, a disease going in and attacking this particular crop. If we look at an old field, what was the fields like 100 years ago? That's likely to survive because it has a huge amount of biodiversity. Sometimes what happens is that there's going to be something called a bottleneck. That is when we have a disturbance or immigration where it drastically reduces the population size, and maybe because they're moving, or basically maybe because there is some disaster, it may kill some of the organisms. Now when that happens, there's going to be a smaller population. because some of them died randomly, it doesn't reflect the original diversity of the original population. So if we take the original population, which is the blue, evenly between the blue, white, and yellow little dots, and we pour some into a bottleneck event, sort of like the Asians coming over into North America via the Bering Strait. Only a limited number came in. Not all the people from Europe and Asia came over, and Europe, Asia, and Africa. And therefore they have a certain genome. The surviving population, the moving population, did not have the great variety that there was originally. Sometimes the bottleneck reduces the genetic diversity. Because it is smaller, it is more vulnerable to future environmental disturbances. So if we have a bottleneck response and we all of a sudden go to black and brown mice, what happens if there's snow? They're all going to be susceptible to predators. Sometimes there's an inbreeding depression. That's where, because of, for example, with the cats, they do not have huge amount of genetic diversity because there's not as much mutations in felines. When they inbreed, that means that they're going to have sex with family members, and when that happens, there's going to be an increased chance that there's going to be genetic mutations that lead to problems. For example, if we have these cougars that they interbreed, and they interbreed, there's more likely there's going to be a problem with the recessive alleles. Because of smaller populations, more chance of not being able to find a non-related mate. For example, in the early 1900s, the panther population in Florida went down to 30 due to hunting, habitat loss. Because of inbreeding depressions, there was problems with the cougar, and they had kinked tails, heart defects, low sperm count. However, back in 1995, cougars were brought from Texas, which alleviated this problem. If you look here, you can see the kinked tail, the heart defects, and the problems with the sperm. Sometimes an ecosystem oftentimes has resilience, in other words, it is able to return to its original condition after a major disturbance. If there's a high species diversity, there's going to be a higher economic ecosystem resilience. High species diversity means more plants to repopulate the disturbed ground. And so if we look at here, we have obviously more species to come in and replace. So let's try an FRQ. Could you describe one of the three levels of biodiversity? Could you explain how high biodiversity at the level you described is beneficial to the ecosystem?